probably the biggest efficiency is when I think everybody goes through this phase where you get into recording and you just want to mix, right? You see all the cool mixing plugins and videos. So you just speed through the recording process just to get something laid down so you can have fun mixing. And you mess up the recording and you don't make it sound very good. And then you spend all your time trying to fix a bad recording. I think people think that's what mixing is. And if you can get over that hump to the part of realizing, oh, the reason my songs aren't sounding as good as I want isn't because I need to get better at mixing. I really need to rewind and get better at the recording thing, both like recording technique and production and all that creative stuff. That at least for me as a person who loves technology, that the recording part's a lot of work, but like mixing's fun. I get to like bring in the new plugin and try a new routing thing and all those fun things. But if you don't get the first part right, the mix is, you'll always think of mixing as like this big Band-Aid rather than like the really fun creative tool that it is. So I found the better my recording sound, just raw, the more fun the mixing process is, of course, but also it goes by pretty quickly. I can, sometimes the song is 45 minutes and we're pretty much there, versus wrestling with a shaker track for 3 hours because you recorded it wrong, right? That's an extreme example, but yeah.
No, that's awesome. And I know also you harp on this, getting it right at the source.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, maybe you can harp on it on the podcast here.
Yeah, so I've been saying it for the actually back to Graham. So we did a podcast together called the Simply Recording Podcast that ran for a couple of years. We had 30 or so episodes. Wasn't nearly as prolific as this one, but we the very first episode was called Get It Right at the Source. We were like, how do we start this? We're like, well, that's the way to start it. And the idea has evolved over the years, because initially I just meant it as, I'm not saying I invented the phrase, but I've just harped on it so much. Originally for me, it just meant record it well, but that's expanded to produce it well. Like you can have a well-recorded, boring song, right? The guitar track sounds good, but it's boring. So like there's that element of recording and production being two different things. But then if you just keep going up the signal chain, you keep finding other ways to improve the source, like obviously equipment and things like that, but the song itself, the performer, maybe this person shouldn't be the one playing guitar on this. Maybe that's the wrong guitar. Maybe that's the wrong chord progression. Maybe those lyrics don't make sense. You just kind of keep rewinding, and there's so many things that constitute the source in my head, and all of those really need to be in place before that first recording session, or you end up, because once you record it, you know what it's like. You record it, and then you live with these things that you've done for weeks and months as you finish the project. So if you're going to have to live with it, you might as well take a little more time on the front end, making sure it's all right and good. Because then you're just kicking yourself, and it becomes a frustrating process.
Yeah. I feel like there's a balance there also, because I feel like, people have been talking about on the show also about just like, capturing and then analyzing later, because you don't want to ruin that inspiration, because sometimes you just need to get into it before you forget about it, before you lose that kind of momentum. And so I guess the balance is making sure that you're I don't know, you have good microphones in a good room. I don't know, stuff like that. Easily accessible. I don't know. Maybe there's got to be that balance between knowing you're going to get it right at the source, but also being open to that like initial burst of inspiration. Yeah,
and some of that is just you get to a point where like I don't slave over recordings anymore. Like I set up the mics the way I've done it 1,000 times, and I just check to make sure it sounds good, and then we just go. So it's not like it's 3 hours of A-Bing 8 different microphones on the snare, like that kind of obsessive thing. But I think in the beginning there needs to be some of that. Like I tell the story of when I was still working at Sweetwater, and I was working on an album of my own music, and I got a couple microphones, set them up in stereo, and I set aside a Saturday to record all the guitars for this upcoming thing. So I spent the whole day just knocking out guitars for like 10 songs. Really proud of myself. Took like 3 weeks off, right? Because that's what we do. And came back and listened, and they were all super muddy and boomy. I was in an apartment, and there were, noisy kids upstairs, and I was trying to get as close to the mics to minimize noise, but I got too close, right? And on the headphones I had, it sounded okay, because I was listening in the room, and it was the sound of the guitar and everything else, and just thinking about 1,000 different things and the performance. kind of being in that zone, like you mentioned, but I was just too close to the mics. And I ended up spending that whole album fixing those guitars when it probably would have made more sense just to go back and re-record them. And so I think that's the thing. Like you do that a couple of times, you realize, oh, this thing I'm doing causes muddy guitars every time. Once I fix that, now like that's a mistake I don't make anymore because it was such a painful one to live through. But yeah, I think certainly it's better to capture something than nothing for sure. But I think also to recognize what you can and can't do later using plugins and things like that. Like there's only so much they can do.
Totally.